So here's what we have here, right? What the fundamental fantasy does is it tells us what we desire. So need, demand, desire. So Lacan formulates this dialectic where you go from need to desire. Okay, so there's this famous sentence from the Acree. It's in the paper called The Signification of the Phallus. And Lacan says, this is why desire is neither the appetite for satisfaction, need, nor the demand for love, demand, but the difference that results from the subtraction of the first, need, from the second, demand, the very phenomenon of their splitting. Okay, so Zizek has he talks about this in pretty clear terms in Looking Awry. So Zizek says the Lacanian distinction between need, demand, and desire, i.e., the way an everyday object destined to satisfy some of our needs, undergoes a kind of transubstantiation as soon as it is caught in the dialectic of demand and ends up producing desire. When we demand an object from somebody, its use value, the fact that it serves to satisfy some of our needs, eo ipso becomes a form of expression of its exchange value. The object in question functions as an index of a network of intersubjective relations. I'm realizing this isn't as clear as I thought it was, but I'll break it down. He continues, if the other complies with our wish, he thereby bears witness to a certain attitude towards us. The final purpose of our demand for an object is thus not the satisfaction of a need attached to it, but confirmation of the other's attitude towards us. When, for example, the mother gives milk to her child, the milk becomes a token of her love. So, okay, here's what's going on. The baby has basic biological needs. It has to eat in order to stay alive. But what happens is once the child starts demanding food, at first it's through the cry, but once it has language, it can start to articulate the demand. I want this. Give me this, right? What happens is that the demand enters the need, the biological impulse, into this whole other register. At first, it's merely about the use value. I just need, in the case of hunger, I just need the sustenance of the food so I can live. But once it enters language and the kid starts demanding food, now it's demanding certain types of food. And the example I gave you not too long ago is, and it's a cute little example. Like, you imagine a little kid. Little kid wants a snack. So hunger, right? But the kid says to its mom, hey, I want a popsicle. And so the mom goes to the freezer, gets a popsicle, takes it to the kid, and the kid's like, no, this is orange. I don't want orange. I want cherry. So the mom goes back to the freezer and gets a cherry one. But then the kid's like, no, I don't want this cherry one. I want the other cherry one, right? And so what the kid's actually doing here is the mom is having to prove that she loves the kid through how much she's willing to put up, right? How much of an inconvenience she's letting the kid be. Mm-hmm. And so the biological need isn't what's fundamentally at work here. It's the demand for love, right? But, and here's where we transition into desire. The demand for love is still linked in some way to a proof of love, to an object, right? To some specific thing that would, even though it's not primary, it would still satisfy a basic need. But when Lacan says desire is what happens when need is subtracted from demand, then you're in this whole other register altogether where you want stuff, but it has nothing to do with your biological imperatives. It has nothing to do with that. It's a whole other order unto itself. And this is where desire arises for Lacan. Now, again, there's many different ways he talks about the emergence of desire. This is one of the earlier ones, but it gives us a sense that, yeah, desire is not tethered to biology or biological needs. It's two steps removed from that. But Lacan was basically trying to show how desire emerges out of need. And so we go back up to fundamental fantasy. Where are we here? Okay, so this whole thing about desire emerging in this way is interesting, and I wanted to touch on it because it is a theory of the emergence of desire. But I think the one that's more important is from seminar 11, which, as we've talked about, it's arguably his most important seminar, and it's the whole process of what he calls separation. And this is much more relevant to fundamental fantasy, as we'll come to see. So what is separation? Well, up until seminar 17, or seminar 11, I'm sorry, Lacan had talked about alienation, right? And we've already seen this. We didn't use the term, but in the imaginary, you are alienated. And there's a kind of fundamental ontological alienation for you to become an ego at all. It's not the kind of alienation Marx is talking about where, oh, we're alienated from the products of our labor or from the very process of labor, right? It's not the forms of alienation that for Marx we need to undo, we need to get out of, but this alienation is part of our ontology. And we're
base reality.
Say what?
It's just base reality, right? Like,
well, it's part of our sense of self, right? Our ego, right? And again, it's not that, despite Lacan's criticisms of the ego psychologist, he's not saying, oh, we have to make human beings not have egos, right? That's not what he's saying. He knows that the ego is a fundamental part of human reality. It's not going anywhere. It just can't be the focus. And there's a way that analysis has to get beyond it to do any real work that's effective. But you are alienated at the core of your identity precisely because your mirror image, and not just that primary identification with your mirror image, but all the things that you identify with, the bands you like, the books you like, the movie stars that you wish you could be, like all of these various things that you identify with are not you. And so your identity, who you are at the ego level, is based on all these external things, right? But so therefore your whole identity is based on alienation. And yet it's not an alienation you can ever really get rid of. You just have to recognize that alienation is at the core of human reality. And so that's imaginary alienation. That's going on with the ego. But there's also symbolic alienation where, and I think, for us with Heideggerian backgrounds, it helps to talk about Dossmann here, where once you're in language or once you're in the social order, you're never fully you, right? You always have to be some kind of generic self. You have to take on this generic protocol that, there's the way of doing what one does in society. You have to do what one does in order to be in society at all. And so you're alienated in this other that you are not, but is also at the core of your existence. Like, you can't get rid of Dossmann. You can't get rid of the big other. You wouldn't be you, right? You are your position in society. You are the signifiers that you identify with, the values, right? You are, and all of this is largely embodied. You're not even thinking about it at the egoic conscious level. You just live it. And so there's this double alienation. One has to do with the ego and the imaginary. The other has to do with the big other and the symbolic order. But, and what's interesting, again, Lacan uses this term extiment, right? And it's a neologism that combines the word intimate with the word exterior or external with intimate. So what is most intimate to us is something external, something outside us. And this is part of the paradox of human subjectivity, is you are the other. You are these things that you are not. And so the core of subjectivity is inhabited by an alien alterity, whether it be the imago or the signifier, whether it be images of yourself or language or social positions or customs or laws or rules, right? They're essential. They're an essential core of who you are, and yet you aren't reducible to them, and they're not reducible to you. So in that sense, they're extiment.
I mean, I always feel like, in case you tied it into Heidegger, I always feel like Lacan is basically doing the next step. Like all of these other people tried to do the next step. Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and Levinas all tried to be Heidegger 2.0, but and they all kind of succeed in their own ways. And Foucault, even in his own, everyone kind of like takes that project from being in time division one off in its own direction. But this, what the part I'm most interested in, this gets to the stuff I'm most interested in, because all of the three main categories that make up Dasein, the kind of being that we are, that humanity is, or that any kind of being that lives in temporality and has projects and a life with others, and any being in language, right, it has certain fundamental components that you could say are the structural conditions for the sense of self or of the world or others that arises. And for Heidegger, that's going to be understanding, discourse, and mood. And I kind of explained that in the Big Mood essay, and I'll explain it in my next essay a bit more in depth. But right now, the main thing I'm trying to get at is that those three categories, all three of them are existentials, or existential categories. Each one of them is, unlike in modern philosophy. In modern philosophy, there's always like a fundamental, like you have like the base thing that everything else builds off of. These three things are no one is prior to the others. All three of them are equally original. And so these categories, understanding, discourse is through language, understanding is through knowledge and through intellect and through all of these other things, and then you've got mood, fundamental attunement to the world, or your fundamental disposition within the world. All three of those are being with. Right? So where modern philosophy, gets off, and Anglo-Saxon philosophy kind of remains a lot of the time, is this kind of idea that like, well, I can't be sure of anything else. All I know is that I exist, says Descartes, using language, which is a thing that is necessarily being with. It doesn't make sense. Language doesn't make any sense to think that you're enmeshed in not just language, but also the possibility of understanding that language, the possibility of using that language, of internalizing the rules of language and the symbolic order and the laws and the prohibitions and the norms, and then your fundamental attunement within those conditions, your fundamental mood within those conditions. All of those things play off of each other to make us what we are. But then Lacan takes and goes like a layer deeper. So these are all still being with categories. That's kind of what the word extimate is perfect for getting at what Heidegger was using for being with, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think about another way to, I like to talk about it, right? If somebody thinks that they are truly who they are in and of themselves, to go back to, the way we talk about the liberal concept of the ego, the libertarian concept of the ego, the capitalist, all you have to do is use the thought experiment of a feral child. Right? A kid who never got language. It shows you don't end up with a human subject. Of course, there's a member of our species there, but there's not a human being in the sense that we use the term. Mm-hmm. And it's precisely because of the lack of language that this human brain did not get language, did not get the big other installed in it at the point in its life where it needed it in development to become a human subject. And so that kind of thought experiment helps to show how much you depend on becoming alienated in the big other to be a subject at all. And so alienation, again, is part of our ontological being, our essence, right? Even though the whole point of Lacan is that we are these lacking subjects, right? We're the subjects who lack our being, because that's what objet petit a is. If I could get it, I could get that thing I'm missing, I would be whole. And not at the imaginary level, like at the level of the image, but just at the level of human subjectivity. And that's precisely, so it's this high idea that we only are desiring subjects so long as we are alienated and incomplete. And so this brings us, right, we've talked about alienation, but in Seminar 11, Lacan introduces the concept of separation. And separation has to do with the child's relation to the mother's lack. Now, Lacanians they have this word mother, right? But when they write it, the M is in parentheses, and then the O in the word mother is capitalized. So it's the mother. Yeah, it's
Right.
the big other, the big other in the mother, in the empirical, the primary caregiver.
And by the way, side note, we did this last time. We're not going to do it again. This is a primary caregiver. We're using this word loosely. So
yeah, the mother is a function. It's not a biological sex or the biological mother. It's the mother is the child's primary caregiver, and the father is whoever steps in and separates the child from the mother, and that could be a biological woman.
Yeah.
So again, these are social positions and not mythological figures or biological types.
Right.
So yeah, but separation also involves the production of objet petit a. So this is more relevant to where we're going with fundamental fantasy. And after this, we're going back to fundamental fantasy. So I'm going to use another quote from Sean Homer because I think this is really good. He says, "As with the subject, the other is also lacking." So the baby starts to perceive the primary caregiver lacks something, and that the baby isn't sufficient to satisfy that lack, to fill that void, right? There's something besides the baby that the mother, primary caregiver, desires. And LACAN will call this the imaginary phallus. And again, maybe we'll talk about, when we talk about sexuation, if we get there tonight, we can talk about the phallus. But
cool.
Phallus does not mean penis. It's not, don't form, an identification with those two terms. I think it would be better to have a different term for what he's talking about. He's just referring to the lack in the mother. That you can tell the mother wants something, desires something besides the child, and you can tell, like, it's almost like intentionality in phenomenology. The baby can perceive the mother's intentionality is drifting other places, right? It's not staying focused on the child. And so the child's starting to get some vague sense of, oh, what's the thing that mom wants that I'm not, right? And so the baby perceives the lack in the other. So Sean Homer continues. And I should say, this lack in the other, this is what makes the other barred or lacking or incomplete, right? The other is also a subject of desire. So he goes on to say, there remains something essentially unfathomable in the desire of the other for the subject, the baby. What LACAN calls separation is the encounter with the lack in the other and the want to be, more than merely lack. Separation involves the coincidence or overlapping of two lacks. It's like, okay, I lack something, and the mother lacks something, and what I lack and what she lacks, they don't coincide, right? And so this is where there's a separation between the mother-child unity, right?
Right.
So there's a lack in the subject and in the other. The interaction between these two lacks will determine the constitution of the subject. So
exactly. And this is why the first few years of your life are the most formative years of your life. How you develop into the symbolic, how you integrate into, how you are assimilated into that order in relation to coping with these fundamental separations and breaks. That's going to be constitutive. Which means it constructs, it builds that subjectivity. Right. So
absolutely. I mean, that, even though objet petit a, right? LACAN said it was his greatest concept. If Heidegger, think about different Heidegger or different philosophers, though. We think Deleuze is the philosopher of difference. Heidegger is the philosopher of being. Sartre's the philosopher of freedom, right? I think it's fair to say LACAN, even though he wouldn't call himself a philosopher, let's call him a thinker. LACAN's a thinker of lack, because the phallus is a lack, and the desire of the other involves a lack, and objet petit a is a lack, and signifiers themselves in isolation from other signifiers have no signifieds. They have a lack. And so he's finding lack everywhere. And the various lacks we encounter in childhood, the ones we pursue, the ones we identify, all of this forms our particular subjectivity. And so I think it's best to think of him as this thinker of lack. But Sean Homer goes on, he says, separation therefore takes place at precisely the point that the subject can formulate the question, what am I in the other's desire, right? This is where you're like, you break away, and the other's desire has a kind of monstrous impenetrability about it, where you can't figure out what the other wants from you. Even if the other tells you what they want, it doesn't necessarily, it's not satisfying.
Right, because if your parents tell you they want you to be a good kid at school and not hit the bully, they actually might secretly wish that you hit the bully, that kind of thing.
I have used that example before. I love that example because
I got that example from you, yeah.
Yeah, the kid goes home, right? The kid's hey, we don't believe in violence in this family. It's never right to punch. It's never right to hurt another person. And the kid is being bullied at school. And so the kid takes the non-violent approach as the parents have dictated, right? He thinks he's going to satisfy their desire by not hitting back. And he goes home, he tells the parents about the bullying and what happened, and they go, oh, that's very good. We're very proud of you that you didn't hit back. And yet he can detect a gap, a separation. Like, I hear what you're saying. You're saying you're proud of me, but I can tell that you're disappointed. So what do you really want from me, right? And so there's this, it also works in an inverted way, right? So say the kid says, oh, screw it, I am going to punch back, right? And so the kid goes home, and the kid's afraid he's going to be punished because he didn't obey the law of the parents, right? The demand of the parents. And yet once he tells them what happened, they start saying, well, we really do believe in nonviolence, and it's wrong to solve your problems with violence. But we understand why you did what you did. But despite what they're saying, he detects a certain joy in them that he beat up the bully. And so this is the split, right? Like, no matter what somebody tells you, what they want from you, you can't be sure of that because they themselves have an unconscious.
Right.
Like, I can't figure myself out, let alone how can I possibly figure out somebody else's desire? And because we're all split subjects. And so this creates anxiety, right? Yeah, somebody just mentioned anxiety, legal and free. Yeah, we're going to get into anxiety in a minute. This is one of the causes of anxiety for Lacan, is this unfathomable, impenetrable enigma of the other's desire. You're telling me you want this from me, but I can tell you want something else. But you can also get a sense like, I don't think you even know what you want from me, right? And yet for a child, think about how much you're helpless. You can't take care of yourself as a human baby. Your whole life depends on the other desiring you, wanting to be there to take care of you, right? So it's like your whole biological reality necessitates being positioned properly in relation to the other's desire. And so it's this like horrifying anxiety that you feel like, oh, if I don't satisfy the other's desire, if I don't keep their intentionality fixated on me, I'm going to die. I'm not going to be okay. And so when people tell you, oh, I don't care what others think of me, it's bullshit. I mean, this goes to the very core of who we are, is we're always caught up with the other's desire. This is why Lacan says desire is the desire of the other. On the one hand, you desire to be desired by the other, but you also end up desiring what the other desires because you believe that's what's going to make them desire you, right? And so this whole thing, like, we care about what the other desires or what the other thinks to the core of our being. We never get rid of that. And anybody who says otherwise is like in a kind of bad faith or inauthenticity, right? It's not authentic to say, oh, I don't care what the other thinks. Yes, of course, there's times that there's certain people you don't really care what they think, but you always care about what some other thinks, right? It goes to the core of your being. And so just to finish this quote up, right? So he said, what am I in the other's desire? And can thus differentiate itself from the desire of the other, right? In pondering what the other desires, not knowing what the other desires, you can't actually identify with it and make it your own desire. So your desire is not identified with the other's desire. There's a split. And that's how your desire comes into being. Because you don't know what the other desire, you can't desire what the other desires because you don't know what it is. And so this whole like enigmatic, impenetrable aspect of the other is, part of where your desire originates. And so he concludes, while the desire of the other always exceeds or escapes the subject, there nevertheless remains something that the subject can recover and thus sustain him or herself in being, as a being of desire or a desiring subject. That remainder is the objet petit a, the object cause of desire. And again, his point is desire is desiring something, and every object of desire that it thinks is going to satisfy itself, it doesn't. And so there's this elusive missing object that desire is always chasing, and it never can get its hands on it. But nevertheless, this is what orients desire at the most basic level, is this objet petit a, and that's what causes you to desire. Think about the object cause of desire, the object that causes you to desire. All of us can think about 100 different objects of our desire. I want a new TV. I want this book. I want that. I want a new car, right? But the question is, what causes us to desire those particular objects of desire, right? And so for LACAN, he doesn't think it's very interesting, the specific objects we desire on whatever day. What is interesting is that cause of desire, right? Those traits or those characteristics that we have libidinally invested, right, unconsciously, we're not aware of this, that we link to whatever is missing in our lives, that cause us. This is why people tend to they repeat relationship patterns. People often tend to date the same person over and over again. There's certain traits, certain characteristics that we link through our whole libidinal history, like our whole life is involved in this. But we come to associate certain features, certain traits with the missing object, objet petit a, and it's like, when we think we see something, the unconscious registers it, and it's like, there's the missing object, right? But you get it, and it's not, because the missing object there's no real original missing object. It's a virtual effect of having to take on prohibition and language and custom. And so there is no real missing lost object to regain. It's just a virtual effect of language. And so the point is, we're almost back to fundamental fantasy. So I'll just say that separation also refers to the split subject, right? So the split subject, barred S in relation to the little a, which is what we're working on with fantasy. However, the subject is this very split, this object relation, right? That's the key thing, is when you see the barred S and the A, you have to go, that is me. Not just the barred S, but the missing A. I am my pursuit of this missing part of myself, right? And so here's the thing, though. If we were to overcome this loss, if we were to actually regain the lost object, which again is impossible, but just to make the point, it would destroy us. We would cease to be desiring human beings. We would have no lack, and we would revert back to some kind of pre-linguistic infant, right? It would destroy our very social reality and sense of self. So the thing that you're pursuing your whole life, if you actually could get it, which you can't, it would be utter existential destruction. And so that's kind of the tragic aspect of the Lacanian subject, right? But okay, so now
we interrupt this conversation for a quick message from our sponsors.
You may recognize this conversation from the past because it is actually a piece of a longer live stream. So what I've done is I've edited the conversations I had with Mikey down into smaller chunks, and I will be releasing those serially until the launch of the Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do course, taught by Michael Downs and myself. I will be asking him the questions and hystericizing him, along with a cohort of people who will be joining us live and in the forums as we do a close reading of what Slavoj Žižek claims is his most important theoretical work, more important than Sublime Objective Ideology by far. He said that if you don't have anything to say about For They Know Not What They Do, then keep silent when it comes to Sublime Objective Ideology. But we don't just do close, thorough, hardcore readings. We also have some more introductory stuff. And so if you go to theory-underground.com/events, then you'll be able to see the dates of all of the upcoming events. You see that the Idea of University, taught by myself, Brian, and a couple of educators who are very close to me. And we wanted to focus on Carl Jasper's short work, The Idea of University, as a way to start the year, but it's also a way for Theory Underground to get off on the right track. January 25th is the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness course that I'm co-teaching with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia podcast. And then in February, on the 25th of February, launches GJX for They Know Not What They Do. Mikey has spent 2 decades getting himself to the point where he feels confident enough to teach this book. And I think that humility and effort that he's put in is something that we can all learn from. I mean, come on. He's like our own homegrown Zizek. He's like our own national treasure. I think that we really ought to uplift him and give credit where it's due, not just take him for granted and act like, we don't need to. So that's a part of the reason actually why I really appreciate Brian Becker from Singularity to Sublimity podcast. He's done a lot of amazing teaching work himself. A lot of people read the blog and then don't give credit where it's due. And that would be fine if he had a cushy academic career with tenure and all that. But he doesn't. He's working in a warehouse, supporting his mom. We need to hashtag free Mikey from wage labor so that he can spend more time doing what his passion is, which is teaching philosophy and theory, writing books. That's what we want. More of these kinds of conversations. Make it possible. Make a donation. 5, 15, 20, 50, 100. Make the donation today. Please. It means a lot. Words are cheap. Money? That's where it matters. Get your skin in the game. Show Mikey you care. I hope that we'll get to do a lot more of this in the near future. And then the last thing, I'm doing a countrywide tour this year. I will be on the East Coast, I will be on the West Coast, and I will be everywhere in between. So if you want me to come to your town or city, email me. It's down below. If you want to volunteer, be a part of the street team, host or guide while we're there, let me know. I hope to be in a city near you sometime this year, and I hope that you'll take one of my classes. Thanks.